Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show about anarchism, non-domination, cooperation, mutual aid in our everyday lives. I am your host, Graham Culbertson, and we are back to the series on David Graeber's book, Debt. This is Chapter 11, The Age of Great Capitalist Empires. As always, I'll be having a discussion with an expert who can help me evaluate the truth of some of Graeber's claims. This time, because I know I've been quite Eurocentric throughout this series, I'm going to have someone on who can address the entire global system, the connection between European colonialism, the precious metals extracted from the Americas, and the Chinese economy. Graeber briefly puts all that together. Using the work of the eminent scholar Kenneth Pomeranz, I'll be talking to Chris Issett, who is a historian of China and capitalism, to make sense of that, and especially Graeber's use of Pomeranz and China in this book. And then there is only one chapter left, Chapter 12, and before I do my episode on Chapter 12, I'm going to have my final debt discussion with Yanis Varoufakis, whose new book, Techno-Feudalism, is about what capitalism has transformed into. And what capitalism has transformed into is also the subject of Chapter 12, Graeber's final chapter. So after my conversation with Yanis, I will finally publish my final episode in this show, and it will be about 2 years after I started this thing. I published the first prequel episode in May of 2023, and so I'm thinking March, April, May for that final thing. Wow. All right. Let's get to the chapter. As I think I've said with most of the recent chapters, this isn't going to be a step-by-step walkthrough through the argument of the chapter, like from Cliff Notes or Wikipedia. This chapter is 50 pages long, more than even. It would take me forever to give you an overview. And again, the parts about China, I'll talk to Chris about, and then there's bullion and credit, and I still think that whole thing is, I don't know, mostly wrong or at least overstated. If you listen to my episode with John Weisweiler, he talks about all the stuff that Graeber gets right about bullion. If you listen to my episode with Luke Kemp, he talks about what Graeber gets wrong about the cycle of history and its relation to bullion. So, I mean, those are just two things in the backstory. Hopefully you've listened to those already. So what am I going to talk about with this chapter? I'm going to focus on what I think is the main idea, which is the question of what capitalism is. And Graeber says capitalism is the product of shame and guilt and anxiety and resentment when those things are financialized. So, where does Graeber say this is what capitalism is? Well, he's got a section in Chapter 11 that he calls, So, what is capitalism anyway? And I thought he was then going to explain what capitalism is. But he doesn't, not succinctly. Instead, as I've realized, and I think I've mentioned this before, he saves a succinct explanation of the main idea of a chapter for the next chapter. So since Chapter 11 is the one about capitalism, it's Chapter 12 that actually has the clear definition of capitalism as the union of shame and honor and financialization. So here's the definition, not from So What is Capitalism Anyways, but from Chapter 12. Capitalism isn't the rule of the financier, but actually what Graeber calls an alliance between financier and warrior. Capitalism is, quote, the cold, calculating math of the banker and the warrior who, indebted, has abandoned any sense of personal honor and turned himself into a kind of disgraced machine. So there's the answer. Capitalism is a system in which a warrior who feels shame that he has been dominated by a banker is desperately trying to regain his sense of honor by dominating everyone else, even though he can never regain his sense of honor because the fact that he's doing it for a banker means that he is permanently disgraced. An unusual claim, but a pretty convincing one. To me, let's see how Graeber gets there. As he so often does, he starts with a contradiction. He calls it a, quote, peculiar paradox. He says we're used to thinking of, quote, modern capitalism, along with modern traditions of democratic government, as emerging with the age of revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, the American and French revolutions, which are a series of profound breaks at the end of the 18th century that only become fully institutionalized after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. All right, that's the end of the quote, and I do think this is the way we are used to thinking, although this idea of pushing capitalism back into the 15th and 16th centuries, it's gaining ground lately. All right, now, Graeber says when we look at the 16th century where capitalism is not supposed to be, we can see capitalism. Quote, "It would seem that almost all elements of financial apparatus that we've come to associate with capitalism, central banks, bond markets, short selling, brokerage houses, speculative bubbles, securitization, annuities, came into being not only before the science of economics, which is perhaps not too surprising, but also before the rise of factories and wage labor itself." All right, that's the end of the quote. So, if capitalism is a system of production and exchange that has to do with finances and capital, that system actually comes before the things we associate with capitalism: the science of economics, factories, wage labor, political liberalism, etc. Proponents of capitalism from Smith to Hayek seem to have gotten this wrong as well. They associate capitalism with dignity and freedom and democracy, as well as banks and factories. But first of all, Graeber says, and I agree, came capitalism, and dignity and freedom and democracy and factories and even modern banks came later. And what Graeber calls the secret scandal of capitalism is, quote, "At no point has it been organized primarily around free labor." So Graeber says, and he's absolutely right, if capitalism is supposed to be this thing that happens in this age of revolution when we get democracy and the dignity of the worker and trading, and then occasionally, the banks swoop in and monopolists mess this up, then colonialism and imperialism and slavery and rape and exploitation and just all around terror should be the things that capitalism has moved beyond. But not only does capitalism not seem to be moving beyond them, it also started with these horrors, and exactly against the theory, seems to be always and forever creating new horrors. So despite the Whiggish histories of progress made by capitalists and the defenders of capitalism, whether they are right-wingers named Friedman and Hayek or progressives named DeLong and Krugman, capitalism just continues to be a giant machine for terrorizing people and extracting profit from them. And remember, this machine is really two machines: a financial machine and a war machine that answers to the financial machine. And Graeber says the original alliance between warriors and financiers is the great voyages of discovery, conquest, slavery, and exploitation of the 15th and 16th century. This means that the first capitalists weren't 19th century British factory owners, but 16th century warriors who were indebted to 16th century bankers. So Graeber makes Hernan Cortés, the conquistador, the protagonist of this chapter on capitalism. This seems ridiculous if you think capitalism is about bookkeeping and paperwork and lawyers and profits and democracy and started around 1789. But if you think capitalism is about the lust to conquer and the desire for power, combined with the mantra of perpetual growth, all wrapped together in the figure of an insecure leader who needs to be a winner, otherwise he will be a loser, then Cortés is a good emblem of the first capitalist, and capitalism is really about insecure would-be leaders desperately trying to stay out of debt by putting everyone around them in debt. And I'll talk more about this later, but this is actually a great description of both Elon Musk and Donald Trump. I'm sorry, I would love for this podcast to be a Trump and Musk free zone, but one, it's impossible, and two, if you're having a hard time figuring out what's happening, I think Graeber's explanation of capitalism makes sense. Musk and Trump want to be Cortés. All right. Graeber says that Cortés and all the other conquistadors act the way they did because they are not accountant-style capitalists trying to make money, but they are also adventure-style capitalists trying to secure a thrilling, heroic victory. We've been running up against this idea for a while in the Debt Book. As you may recall, one of his funniest attacks on conventional ideas is his claim in the chapter on the Middle Ages that the Christian image of a heroic knight isn't very similar to what Northern European warriors were actually doing, but is quite similar to what Muslim merchants were doing. Here's a long quote, but I think it's worth it. The romances were a new sort of literature featuring a new sort of hero, the knight errant, a warrior who roamed the world in search of precisely adventure in the contemporary sense of the word, perilous challenges, love, treasure, and renown. Stories of knightly adventure quickly became enormously popular. Crétin was followed by innumerable imitators, and the central characters in the stories, Arthur and Guinevere, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, and the rest, became known to everyone, as they are still. This courtly ideal of the gallant knight, the quest, the joust, romance, and adventure remains central to our image of the Middle Ages. The curious thing is that it bears almost no relation to reality. Nothing remotely like a real knight-errant ever existed. Knights had originally been a term for freelance warriors drawn from the younger or often bastard sons of the minor nobility. Unable to inherit, many were forced to band together to seek their fortunes. Many became little more than roving bands of thugs in an endless pursuit of plunder, precisely the sort of people who made merchants' lives so dangerous. Culminating in the 12th century, there was a concerted effort to bring this dangerous population under the control of the civil authorities. Not only the code of chivalry, but the tournament, the joust, all these were more than anything else ways of keeping them in line. Whence, then, this image of the solitary knight-errant, wandering the forests of a mythic Albion, challenging rivals, confronting ogres, fairies, wizards, and mysterious beasts? The answer should be clear by now. Really, this is just a sublimated, romanticized image of the traveling merchants themselves, men who did, after all, set off on lonely ventures through wilds and forests whose outcome was anything but certain. All right, there's the end of that quote. Now, this really messes with our sense of the past pre-1800 or so. Muslim merchants were heroes and adventurers, and Christian knights were thuggish bandits. Chivalry was just invented because the Christian merchants were tired of being brutalized by Christian knights. But although this idea means that our Disneyfied vision of the medieval past was wrong, like I said, it really makes sense of the knights of our current period, the heroic job creators known as billionaires. If capitalism were the simple matter of making money on paper, our image of the capitalist would be a very boring person in a cubicle who spends all day with spreadsheets. The ideal capitalist would be a banker, lawyer, clerk, a very mild-mannered guy who doesn't do anything except move paper around in order to make money. Herman Melville has a hilarious character like this, the narrator of his short story Bartleby the Scrivener. Here's how this character, who is not named, so he's usually just called the lawyer or the narrator, describes himself. I am a man who, from his youth upwards, has been filled with a profound conviction that the easiest way of life is the best. Hence, though I belong to a profession proverbially energetic and nervous, even to turbulence at times, yet nothing of that sort have I ever suffered to invade my peace. I am one of those unambitious lawyers who never addresses a jury or in any way draws down public applause, but in the cool tranquility of a snug retreat do a snug business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man. The late John Jacob Astor, a personage little given to poetic enthusiasm, had no hesitation in pronouncing my first grand point to be prudence, my next method. I do not speak it in vanity, but simply record the fact that I was not unemployed in my profession by the late John Jacob Astor, a name which, I admit, I love to repeat, for it hath a rounded and orbicular sound to it, and rings like unto bullion. I will freely add that I was not insensible to the late John Jacob Astor's good opinion. All right, that's the end of the Melville quote. Now look, all capitalists are undoubtedly parasites. But the lawyer in Bartleby is particularly obviously a parasite. He does no work. His scriveners, his copyists do the actual work for him, nor does he organize any businesses or trade any stocks or bonds. The organizer is John Jacob Astor, who, if you don't know, Astor was the very first super rich businessman in U.S. history, the first person that we could consider a billionaire or robber baron. The lawyer is a parasite on Astor, the billionaire, and a parasite on the scriveners, the labor. This, if the goal of capitalism were to make money, would be the obvious way to be a capitalist. No one has ever applauded the lawyer. Why would he want applause? You wouldn't want applause if the goal of capitalism were simply to make money. But it isn't only about making money. When he mentions Astor's name, he says the name rings like bullion. The name Astor is money. It is also fame. Fame and fortune go together in capitalism. Capitalism is about putting your name, your honor on the line in the grand, heroic quest for money. The lawyer is just a parasite on this grand adventurer. Now, Astor, of course, is also just a parasite. But at least he sent people off on grand adventures. He made the first chunks of his money in the fur trade and later in the opium trade. Eventually, he just made money in New York real estate. But although he did sell some furs himself very early on, he didn't do anything personally. But the Oregon Trail was discovered and really laid down by people he paid. He wasn't an adventurer, but his company did adventuring. Unlike Sinbad the Sailor, the fictional Muslim merchant, or Cortez, the actual conquistador, he was a pretend adventurer, but he was at least in the adventuring business. And we still talk like capitalists are in the adventuring business. We call them captains of fortune, titans of industry, robber barons, masters of the universe, the wolf of Wall Street, corporate raiders. Some of these are positive terms, some of these are negative terms, but all of them suggest that they are putting their lives, their fates, their honor, their names on the line in some sort of epic struggle. For example, to go back sadly to Musk, when you hear people praise him, people often say that he's an engineer. He's a great engineer. People also argue that he's actually not a very good engineer. I don't know. I don't care about that. But people can't imagine that he's just a capitalist. He must be doing something great. I also saw a few years ago, and I try not to follow news about Musk, but you can't help it. He shared a picture of his bedside table once, and there were 2 guns on it because he is such a powerful adventurer. But both of the guns were pretend. One of them maybe was real. It was an 18th century pistol. I don't know whether it was a real 18th century pistol or just a replica. But either way, it was not something you could actually use on an adventure. The other one was a toy plastic gun, a replica from the game Deus Ex, which, by the way, that's a video game about how corporations are terrible. So Elon doesn't get it clearly, but that's obvious. I feel sick talking about this, but look, the guns on his bedside table get to what Graeber is talking about. Capitalists are not adventurers and have not been adventurers for hundreds of years. But to be a great capitalist means that you can't just be a mild-mannered cubicle dweller like the lawyer. You have to at least pretend to be an adventurer, to be Sinbad the Sailor or Cortez the Conquistador. And I do think it is true in one respect. Their lives are not on the line. The guns are pretend. But their honor is, in a real way, on the line. Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg and all the rest are, just like the charismatic heroes described by Graeber and Wingrove in The Dawn of Everything, playing at being heroes for our support, in the same way that professional athletes are playing a game which, if they're good enough, we will support them and love them. This play at heroism is so clearly what Musk's purchase of Twitter was about. He wants to perform as a grand adventurer in front of all of us. And yes, Donald Trump is arguably the person who has taken this the farthest. He made all of his money in New York real estate speculation, like Astor did, but he wasn't even good at it. He's been making money and gaining power just by pretending that he's putting his honor on the line in the game of making money. And since most of Musk's money has come from the US government, I think he's doing the same thing. These guys do not risk their lives. They don't even really risk their name, but their sense of themselves is that they are a heroic adventurer whose success will enrich the accountant's machine. This really brings a lot of the things about capitalism as it exists today together. I've mentioned Adam Smith a lot on this podcast without ever doing a whole episode on him. I still intend to at some point. There's a wonderful quote from The Wealth of Nations that I think I've used before on this show, but I'm going to use it again because it makes sense of this. And sorry, it's a little tricky. Hopefully I can get it right. Smith writes about a hypothetical situation in which there are two manufacturing companies in the same town. And these two companies, they both cost the exact same amount. They're basically factories. They both cost the exact same amount to run. I think Smith says it's 300 pounds because they employ the same number of people who do the same work, and they're the same size and identical in every way, except one of them is owned by a richer guy. And that factory owned by a richer guy buys much more expensive materials and turns them into a more expensive product, and thus makes, like, I think it's 730 pounds of profit. That's what I've got in my notes, but don't quote me. Whereas the one that's owned by the less rich guy only makes 100 pounds of profit. The only difference between these two factories is that the fancier one has 7,000 pounds of capital to invest in fancy materials every year, whereas the less fancy one has only 700 pounds of capital to invest, so they get less fancy materials. Obviously, if the less fancy factory had more capital, they would buy fancier materials and make more profit. So these factories are identical. Everyone who works in them does the exact same job, except one of them transforms 7,000 pounds of capital. I mean, that's British pounds, but let's just use dollars. One of them turns $7,000 into $7,730, therefore $730 of profit. And one of them turns $700 into $800, aka $100 of profit. So the owner, who has 10 times as much money, makes 10 times as much money. How about the guy who runs the factory, who is not the owner? How much does the person who runs the fancy factory get paid? According to Smith, the two managers, you could even call them clerks, who run the two factories get paid the same. Smith writes, that is the clerk who runs this factory, his wages properly express the value of this labor of inspection and direction, meaning managing the factory. Though in settling them some regard is had commonly, not only to his labor and skill, but to the trust which is reposed in him, yet they never bear any regular proportion to the capital of which he oversees the management, and the owner of this capital, though he is thus discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profit should bear a regular proportion to his capital. So what Smith is saying is, if you're a good factory manager, you get paid what factory managers get paid. And if your factory makes $1 billion of profit, you're still going to make a factory manager amount of work, because actually running a factory is a clerk's job. It's just a job type job. It's not about being a merchant adventurer. Speculation of the merchant adventurer kind, of the kind that Sinbad did, or the even more grandiose kind that Cortez did, doesn't have anything to do with running a factory. So this is Smith's image of capitalism. There's the capitalist who doesn't do anything, and then there's the clerks who are basically like the lawyer in Bartleby's story, and they get paid The amount of money that their labor is paid has nothing to do with the amount of capital on the line, and the owner, the capitalist, sits around and does nothing. This is completely wrong. This is paper capitalism. This is how Smith describes capitalism, or how it should be, but it is nothing like that. For one thing, this would make being a capitalist intensely boring. And that's sort of the starting point for Corey Robin's wonderful book about the conservative ideology, The Reactionary Mind. I had Corey on the show, by the way. It was an amazing interview. I'll put a link into the show notes. Robin writes that when he interviewed William F. Buckley, who, for my younger listeners, was the founder of 20th century American conservatism, Buckley said, quote, "The trouble with the emphasis in conservatism on the market is that it becomes rather boring. You hear it once, you master the idea. The notion of devoting your life to it is horrifying, if only because it's so repetitious. It's like sex." I left that part about sex in because it's a famous part of the quote. I'm not just going to touch it. The important part is that for Buckley, making money in the market was just boring. And I think that's because he was thinking of the market in the bloodless terms that you can get from Adam Smith. If you have $7,000 of capital, a clerk can run your business, and you'll get $700 of profit every year. That is so boring. It has none of what Edmund Burke calls the sublime when he's inventing conservatism. And that's why Robin points out this notion of the sublime in conservatism so often in that book. And the sublime is precisely what Cortez is after. Graeber's point is that the outlandish, extreme, monstrous, and even absurd lengths that Cortez went to enrich himself, those efforts which turned the Americas into a hell of death and slavery, are not aberrations in the transition from bloody colonialism to sensible gray flannel capitalism, but the way that capitalism has always worked. Capitalism isn't a bloodless pursuit of profit. It is a blind, even a mad quest for a sublime domination of the universe. Domination which is nevertheless, in a very unsublime way, accounted for in numerical currency by the bankers back home. Here's the hell on earth that Graeber describes from Cortez's era. In The Conquest of America, Tzvetan Todorov, breaking in, that's a history book from the 1980s, Todorov offers a compendium of some of the most chilling reports, mostly from Spanish priests and friars who, even when committed in principle to the belief that the extermination of the Indians was the judgment of God, could not disguise their horror at scenes of Spanish soldiers testing the blades of their weapons by eviscerating random passers-by and tearing babies off their mothers' backs to be eaten by dogs. In addition to this, Graeber has an extensive quote from Friar Motolinia, an actual 16th century Franciscan missionary. Here's Motolinia quoted by Graeber. "The eighth plague was the slaves whom the Spaniards made in order to put them to work in the mines. At first those who were already slaves of the Aztecs were taken, then those who had given evidence of insubordination, finally all those who could be caught. During the first years after the conquest, the slave traffic flourished, and slaves often changed masters. They produced so many marks on their faces, in addition to the royal brand, that they had their faces covered with letters, for they bore the marks of all who had bought and sold them." That's the end of the quote. We are a long, long way from Adam Smith's clerk, who is calmly managing property for an absent capital owner. But although this is utterly inconsistent with Smith's description of how capitalism works, it sounds utterly consistent with the plantation chattel slavery in the Americas up until the 20th century, with the immigrant working conditions in the United States, again up until the 20th century, with factory farming and manufacturing conditions all over the world continuing until today. And Graeber's argument is that you don't get those horrors just from the quest to raise shareholder value. Raising shareholder value would be very, very boring and would be unlikely to create hell on earth. But when one sees oneself as a titanic figure engaging in a life and death struggle, a conqueror whose mistakes and failures will mean not just total loss of honor, but also being forced into the lowest economic position available, all of a sudden the horrors of capitalism make sense. They are the product, as Graeber puts it, of, quote, greed, terror, indignation, and debt. Those are the words he uses to describe Cortez. I think they also describe Musk, Bezos, and Trump. So let's finally deal with this extensive set of quotes from Graeber about Cortez. Graeber also has some pretty. Most of these are quotes from Bernal Diaz, who was one of Cortez's followers and wrote the stories of his conquests. And then Graeber does readings of the quotes. So I'm going to give you long quotes from Diaz and quoted by Graeber, and then Graeber explaining Diaz. Here's Diaz. We were all very deeply in debt. A crossbow was not to be purchased for less than 40 or 50 pesos. A musket cost 100, a sword 50, and a horse from 800 to 1,000 pesos and above. Thus extravagantly did we have to pay for everything. A surgeon, who called himself Master Juan, who had tended to some very bad wounds, charged wildly inflated fees, and so did a quack named Murcia, who was an apothecary and a barber and also treated wounds, and there were 30 other tricks and swindles for which payment was demanded of our shares as soon as we received them. Serious complaints were made about these, and the only remedy that Cortez provided was to appoint 2 trustworthy persons who knew the prices of goods and could value anything that we had bought on credit. An order went out that whatever price was placed on our purchases or the surgeon's cures must be accepted, but that if we had no money, our creditors must wait 2 years for payment. And then Graeber says, quote, Spanish merchants soon arrived, charging wildly inflated prices for basic necessities, causing further outrage until, back to Diaz, our general, that's Cortez, becoming weary of the continual reproaches which were thrown out against him, saying he had stolen everything for himself, and the endless petitions for loans and advance in pay, determined at once to get rid of the most troublesome fellows by forming settlements in those provinces which appeared most eligible for this purpose. And then here's Graeber's explanation. These were the men who ended up in control of the provinces and who established local administration, taxes, and labor regimes, which makes it a little easier to understand the descriptions of Indians with their faces covered by names like so many counter-endorsed checks, or the mines surrounded by miles of rotting corpses. We are not dealing with the psychology of cold, calculating greed, but of a much more complicated mix of shame and righteous indignation, and of the frantic urgency of debts that would only compound and accumulate. These were almost certainly interest-bearing loans. An outrage at the idea that after all they had gone through, they should be held to owe anything to begin with. And what of Cortez? This is more Graeber. He had just pulled off perhaps the greatest act of theft in world history. Certainly his original debts had now been rendered inconsequential, yet he somehow always seemed to find himself in new ones. Creditors were already starting to repossess his holdings while he was off on an expedition to Honduras in 1526. On his return, he wrote the Emperor Charles V that his expenses were such that, quote, all I have received has been insufficient to relieve me from misery and poverty. Being at the moment I write in debt for upwards of 500 ounces of gold, without possessing a single peso towards it. It's the end of the Cortez quote back to Graeber. Disingenuous, no doubt. Cortez at the time owned his own personal palace, but only a few years later he was reduced to pawning his wife's jewelry to help finance a series of expeditions to California, hoping to restore his fortunes. When those failed to turn a profit, he ended up so besieged by creditors that he had to return to Spain to petition the emperor in person. All right, that's the end of the long Graeber quote. I'm sorry I keep making this about Trump, but I see so many similarities. Both of these stories, Cortez and Trump, are about men who could not have been more successful, and also men that were on the point of failure and in absolute debt at all times. Cortez is remembered as a conqueror, but actually ended up a disgraced debtor. Trump will probably also be remembered as a conqueror, but is also a disgraced debtor. And whereas Cortez was an actual conqueror, i.e., commanded men in battle and used weapons, Trump is, like all robber barons since John Jacob Astor, a pretend conqueror. But the suffering of the people remains. There are still people in mines and camps suffering physical horrors like those described by these 16th century chroniclers. Trump and Musk and Bezos have only their honor at stake, no longer their actual lives and actual physical suffering. Graeber ends his chapter with a key point that I'm not totally convinced by, that there's this really complicated relationship between capitalism and eternity. The argument goes that capitalism is about debt, which is to say, quote, money borrowed from future generations in the case of the national debt. And as long as capitalism is about to go on forever, you can borrow infinite money because future generations can always borrow from their future generations. So if it's going to go on forever, you can borrow infinitely. And if you can borrow infinitely, then debt doesn't make sense and capitalism will collapse. So capitalism is just always collapsing, and fearing its own collapse is the default mode. It's the only mode it has. And thus capitalists are always gambling, always moving into this future that is both permanent and non-existent, and happy to destroy the entire world in the quest for that future because it's going to collapse anyway. Like I said, I'm not sure if that's true, but it's a very interesting thought that brings the whole book together and back to the 2008 debt crisis, because he says that this certainty of a great future that leads to infinite debt, which leads to certainty of no great future, is what caused that debt crisis. Presented with the prospect of its own eternity, capitalism, or anyway, financial capitalism, simply explodes. Because if there's no end to it, there's absolutely no reason not to generate credit, that is, future money, infinitely. Recent events would certainly seem to confirm this. The period leading up to 2008 was one in which many began to believe that capitalism really was going to be around forever. At the very least, no one seemed any longer to be able to imagine an alternative. The immediate effect was a series of increasingly reckless bubbles that brought the whole apparatus down. All right, that's the end of the quote. So either the capitalists are afraid that it's all going to come down, in which case they make Cortez-style decisions which can collapse civilization, or they are certain it will never fall, in which case they make Lehman Brothers-style decisions which can collapse civilization. Either way, says Graeber, if we don't get a new way of thinking about debt and the future, the collapse is always coming. In fact, the collapse is always already here. All right, that's it for chapter 11. Please email me at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com if you've got any questions. I'm way behind on answering emails. I think I'm just going to do a few Q&A episodes in 2025 to get me caught up. It always helps if you can give a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple. You can visit me on everydayanarchism.com, which is where you can support the show financially. Thank you so much to everyone who supports the show already. Thanks to my editors who continue helping this show come out when it can. And the music, which you are about to hear, is by David Hill.